George R. R. Martin, his whole life long, even as a science fiction author, even as a horror writer publishing short stories in pulp fiction magazines, has been fascinated by the critique of religion. If you are not fascinated by George R. R. Martin's perspective on religion, don't read the books. Don't read the books and then attempt to adapt them into a TV show. There's a gap here, right? You have to be able to look at the very briefly outlined story of the Dance of the Dragons that George set down on paper and figure out first and foremost what the major thematic, philosophical, and political points are. What's major and what's minor here? Now I'm going to give you a hint. The difficulty of being a lesbian stay-at-home mom, that's not George R. R. Martin's major thematic focus, major political and philosophical interest. No, it's in there. And look, I'm all about lesbian stay-at-home moms sharing their struggles in life. It's in there. It can be a part of the script that you write to adapt this into a TV show. But you know what's a major, incredibly important point, kind of anthropological claim made in the story that George wrote that he set out on paper? There was a time when the average man in Westeros revered the dragons as gods. And in the pages of this short story that we're going to tell and that we're going to now witness being adapted into an HBO TV extravaganza, in these few years, something changed, where they regarded dragons as made out of meat, no different from cows. I happen to be vegan, by the way. Don't eat cows. I neither support the slaughter of cows nor dragons. But I mean, dragon milk? Dragon dairy products? Dragon yogurt? Dragon ice cream? Okay. You have to be able to recognize that in the original story George wrote, this is an historic turning point in his fictional world, in his fictional universe, where people start to look at the dragons in a different way. And then they start to look at the dragon riders in a different way. Now, most of the audience already know the latter part of this argument because it's in the TV show as text, not subtext. Right? There was a time when people presupposed there was a genetic component to riding a dragon, that you needed to be born special to a special lineage of aristocrats. And then, it kind of sort of turned out that seemingly anyone could do it. And, George, his whole life, has been fascinated by false claims of telepathy, false claims about being able to see the future, and the way in which people convince themselves after the fact, in retrospect, that what happened is explained by telepathy or is explained by, clairvoyance, by visions of the future. But they're kidding themselves. They're deceiving themselves that this is a self-justifying pseudonym. His whole life, back when he was a writer of science fiction, back when he was a writer of horror short stories, okay, this is a theme he's interested in again and again. But his primary preoccupation here is the critique of religion and the way in which the religious mentality tames the average person, domesticates the average person, makes the average person meek and weak and mild and humble and conformist instead of being wild and boisterous physically as well as, kind of intellectually voracious, He's interested in the way in which religion functions as a sort of taming technology. And then we, the tamed, adapt biologically over time, not to fit into our natural niche in the forest, but instead to fit into a niche, in a church building, in a cathedral that increasingly expands to encompass the whole of our society. Now, he wrote a story all about this called 7 Times Never Kill Man. I made a YouTube video talking about that got tens of thousands of views many years ago. At that time, I was the first person ever to correctly interpret the text, and I criticized another YouTuber who had incorrectly, misrepresented or misinterpreted the text. Okay, it's a funny controversy to live through. But I don't need to point to stories like 7 Times Never Kill Man that are outside of the Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire literature here. In case you haven't noticed, the Children of the Forest are themselves an example of this same kind of devolution that's fascinated George throughout his whole career and is present in 7 Times Never Kill Man. The Children of the Forest were human beings, not so different from you and I, who developed this technology, right? Presented to the reader as telepathy. Is it really? Right? Bran keeps having these visions of the future, but if you read them carefully and then you look at what happens, what he didn't predict the future. What? He had a vision of a flood coming to the castle in the north and what? These super vague visions. Oh, yeah. In retrospect, we convince ourselves this is seeing the future. And we convince ourselves that this is telepathy, on the basis of these kind of scraps of disjointed information. Okay? Whether this is meant to be real telepathy or merely seemingly so, real clairvoyance or really seemingly, real magic or really seemingly. The Children of the Forest were human beings who developed this technology of living in symbiosis with this blood-drinking tree, right? Again, this comes up in George's science fiction stories again and again in different forms. He has a story dealing with a kind of parasite that feeds on human beings, but it telepathically communicates with them so that they want to sacrifice themselves for this parasite. They want to go live in this cave where they're devoured by these parasites and so on. And there's this whole society that's developed around it on this planet, and where their religion consists of people preaching on behalf of this cave where you go to be devoured by this blob, but this you become the host for this parasite that very gradually kills you. Gradually and painlessly, because again, you're put into this state of euphoria. So their whole religion, their whole society for this whole planet has developed in this reciprocal relationship with a parasite that destroys them. Right? Okay, yeah, well, the Children of the Forest, it's the same thing. Children of the Forest were human beings. And instead of becoming big and strong and wild, they became small and weak and domesticated. They devolved rather than evolved. Once they had developed this, what do we say, parasitic relationship, reciprocal relationship, this social technology of religion, in their case, connected to a network of trees that feeds upon them. And footnote, magical birds. Most of you guys already know what I'm talking about. Most of you guys know what I'm talking about, but you never looked at it that way before. Because almost all critical attention in Game of Thrones is focused on nudity. It's focused on the most shallow and salacious questions of sex. Not even, I was going to say sex and violence. It's just the sex that people are preoccupied. Unfortunately, look, things are not much better in the study of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Supposedly respectable ancient authors get the same kind of incredibly stupid literary analysis that A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones get. And people are just overwhelmed by, money, fame, sex, power, respect. Not necessarily in that order. They're drawn to and become, overwhelmed with some of the shallowest and silliest and stupid elements of the story. And yeah, to some extent, the team of writers who adapted the books into the Game of Thrones TV show, I guess we'd call the original TV show, they were in this way overwhelmed. I mean, everyone notices it. What? Do they think the point of the books is people having random sex with prostitutes? They see the plot as a series of pretexts to have naked women come on camera? What is, again, there isn't even, the original TV show, there isn't even interest in, sword fighting. There isn't interest in war or the tactics of war or how it is men actually fight on a battlefield, which is, by the way, not a series of one-on-one duels, that men actually form up into what you call a hedge, like men fight in formation, like no interest in that, just boobs. It's like, the original Game of Thrones TV show really comes out of that pre-internet culture where people seem to think that like female nudity is something scarce and hard to find. Like if you're 80 years old now, you grew up in that world where it was something special. Ooh, female nudity. But like now it's something we're all drowning in. We're all trying to avoid. Like, yeah. If I wanted to see naked women, like there's a website for that. Like you don't even need to buy a magazine anymore. Come on, this is not hard to find. But the whole way the original TV show was constructed, it's kind of, well, okay. I do think for some people, the first 2 seasons of House and the Dragon, with its focus on motherhood, childbirth, and the horror and fear of like infant mortality, of the possibility women will die given childbirth, of the special struggles of being a repressed lesbian in an ostensibly heterosexual marriage to a gay man, and raising there are some themes there that, again, I assume, frankly, the director and the leading actresses involved were interested in. I mean, a lot of those people are connected to the lesbian community one way or the other, whether they identify as a lesbian or bisexual or as sorry, I'm running out of politically correct adjectives. One of the most important actresses, she simply identifies as they, them. She doesn't want to be identified as male or female. Fair enough. I'm not competing with her to take that slot, okay? If anyone who meets me has any real doubt which gender category I fall into, I've met blind men who figure out that I'm heterosexual and cisgendered male. I mean, somehow you don't even have to look at me to pick up on the vibes. All right? I'm not in a position to choose a more ambiguous category for myself to live in. Okay, my point is, there are emotionally involving themes here. There are things that you may find, like you may break down weeping watching this. You may have your heart leap. You may feel horrified. It is horrifying. I was joking to a friend of mine, like, look, I was really thinking about settling down and having kids again. I had a child with my first wife 13 years ago. She's all grown up now. She's gone off to the Olympics. But I was thinking about having and raising another baby, but then you watch this House of the Dragon, and it shakes you up. It makes you, woo, you're giving it a second thought. Do I really? The horror of pregnancy, childbirth, maternity, raising children, the horror and the struggle of parenthood, that's what the first 2 seasons were largely about. Like, that was most of their weight. That's most of the ballast in the tank. Again, there's no real interest in like war. There's no real interest in politics or political philosophy. There's no interest in democracy. There's no interest in like anthropological analysis of what makes Westeros works. But I think like the single greatest omission of all is this critique of religion. And in George R. R. Martin's case, the critique of religion is linked to telepathy, the various kinds of magic and the various kinds of technology that in his mind, from George's perspective, are linked to the idea of telepathy, what's perceived as telepathy, what's perceived as clairvoyance, as magical powers of the mind, including, the perception or prediction of the future. And, many years ago, I started a series of videos explaining that both the strength and the weakness of George R. R. Martin is that he does not even attempt psychological realism in the writing of these characters. One character after another is a sort of Edgar Allan Poe supervillain. I mean, he claims he never writes truly evil characters. Yeah, well, take a long look at Ramsay Bolton. It's ridiculous. He doesn't attempt to write characters that are psychologically plausible, comprehensible, realistic. What he does is creates a world that's politically realistic. He gives you this context in which these characters operate. And, I mentioned Edgar Allan Poe for a reason. whether or not George actually read Edgar Allan Poe, was influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. George R. R. Martin's idea of how society operates is that each and every person is sharpening a knife to take revenge against their own superiors. Like, it's Marxism on steroids. To what extent George was influenced by Marxism as a young man is another interesting question. This is not class war, right? This is a very bitter individual struggle for personal dignity, right? And you see it with older characters like Barbary Dustin, who again their whole life is just, bent on revenge. Their meaning of life, what makes life tolerable for them is the possibility of revenge, the pursuit of revenge. Okay, but it's also there in like teenage Jon Snow. I forget how young Jon Snow is at the beginning of book 1 of A Song of Ice and Fire. But Jon Snow, even in explaining his own motivations, says to the King of the Wildlings, "Oh yeah, well, you came to this dinner party at my father's house. You remember there was a big table for the aristocrats at the front? You didn't see me sitting there. That's it. Oh, no other explanation needed." Jon Snow's whole existence, it's just to get revenge on his own father, right? Because he's so bitter and resentful that he's born a bastard. He's so bitter and resentful that his own mother didn't love him enough. Even as a teenager, this is how George writes these characters. They're all embittered. They're all seeking revenge. And I guess part of the magic is the extent to which they don't perceive the problem as being the social structure around them. They don't want revenge on the kind of political hierarchy that put them in this position in the first place. And the political hierarchy they would have to subvert or overcome or reform or change in order to really make their own lives tolerable, in order to prevent this happening to someone else, what had already happened to themselves. Instead, they just see the particular people within that hierarchy as a problem, as the person they're spending years sharpening their knives for to take revenge against. So look, that's what people love about these books. They're ridiculous, implausible characters. They're not psychologically believable at all. They don't want the things normal human beings want. They don't have any of the kind of depth or complexity of a real person in the real world. I would love it if we had a single character in the whole literature just say, yeah, you know what? For 5 years, I was really upset about that. But now, looking back, it's no big deal. I'm yeah, gee, how immature, how ridiculous that my whole life was about revenge. Come on. But again, George, he's not interested in that. There's a real sense in which he's not interested in character development. He's not interested in Tyrion Lannister actually becoming mature and perceiving his own younger self as having been, immoral or ridiculous. Nope. Tyrion Lannister wants revenge. Tyrion murders his own father. He doesn't learn anything from it. He doesn't develop. He doesn't mature. Now he wants to murder his sister. That's it. That's his character. That's motivation. Straight out of Edgar Allan Poe. And this can go on for an unlimited number of years. They can destroy themselves. They can destroy the whole world. That's it. But these kind of ridiculous, over-the-top dramas transpire in a politically plausible world. And they raise, for the intelligent reader, these interesting political questions. Does George himself ultimately have a political philosophy? Quite possibly not. Tell you one thing, though. The story that was set out on paper for House of the Dragon, just like everything else George has written in his whole career, is very centrally about revenge in the way I've just described. It is very centrally about this subtle and profound religious transformation of the society that the Andals are living in, whatever you want to say, that the Westerosi hoi polloi have been living in. That their perception of their place in the world profoundly changes when they no longer regard the aristocracy of Westeros as justified by the genetic prerequisite to be a dragon rider, and when they no longer regard dragons as gods. When dragons are no longer something magical. That was the big idea in this short story. It's only so many pages of text being adapted into so many hours of television. That is the big idea to be examined here. And instead, we get a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth and tongue kissing between sexually repressed lesbians who are in a succession of ostensibly heterosexual relationships trying to raise kids.